There are crashes investigators can explain with a broken part, a wrong decision, or a chain of mistakes. But then there are the others, flights that vanished from radar and never truly returned. Wreckage scattered across oceans, mountains, and forests, leaving behind evidence that only deepened the mystery. Make sure to subscribe to Terra Obscura before we begin. A Colorado farm family heard the explosion before they saw it. They were sitting down to supper on a quiet Tuesday evening near Longmont when a sound like distant thunder rolled across the sugar beet fields. Then pieces of an airliner began falling out of it. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-6B, a 4-engine propeller airliner of the era, named Mainliner Denver in cursive script along its nose. It had taken off from Stapleton Airport 11 minutes earlier, climbing through the November dusk on a route that would have carried it through the night to Portland and then to Seattle. 44 people were aboard, 39 passengers, 5 crew, and 1 infant. Most of the fuselage came down in pieces no larger than a kitchen table, scattered across 15 miles of farmland. The first responders smelled it before they understood it. There was a sharp, chemical odor in the wreckage that did not belong. Investigators noticed something else. The sidewalls of the aft baggage compartment had been blown outward. 6 days later, the Civil Aeronautics Board declared this was no accident and turned the entire matter over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What the Bureau did next became, for a generation of forensic agents, the case study they all studied. Every fragment of every suitcase was trucked to a leased warehouse at Stapleton Airport and laid out in the position it had occupied aboard the plane. 43 suitcases were accounted for in roughly recognizable form. One was not. The destroyed suitcase had belonged to a 53-year-old Denver businesswoman named Daisy King, who had been traveling to Alaska to visit her daughter. In her carry-on bag, recovered intact, agents found newspaper clippings she had been saving about her own son. The clippings concerned his arrest record for forgery, theft, and check fraud. His name was John Gilbert Graham. He went by Jack. He was 23 years old. Agents drove to his home in Denver and asked him a few simple questions. He answered most of them. Then his wife, in another room, mentioned something her husband had not. She said that just before they had all left for the airport, Jack had carried a gift-wrapped package down to the basement, where his mother was finishing her packing, and tucked it into her suitcase as a Christmas surprise. Jack told the agents he did not remember any such package. The search warrant came that afternoon. In the house, they found a roll of copper primer wire. They also found a life insurance policy taken out on his mother just before her flight, with Jack listed as the sole beneficiary. The policy was for $37,500, the equivalent of nearly $500,000 in today's currency. Late that night, sitting in an interrogation room at the Denver field office, Jack Graham confessed he had bought 25 sticks of dynamite at a hardware store in Kremling, Colorado, 3 days before the flight. He had bought a 60-minute timer from an electronics supplier downtown. He had soldered the components together with 2 electric primer caps for redundancy, in case one failed. He had wrapped the bundle with binding cord, sealed it in his mother's luggage, and driven her to Stapleton Airport. He had even watched her board. When investigators asked him whether he had thought about the other 43 people on the plane, he reportedly told a psychiatrist later that the number had not concerned him. It could have been 1,000, and it would not have changed what he did. There was one detail no one in the courtroom knew how to handle. In 1955, the United States had no federal statute against blowing up an airplane. Prosecutors could only charge Jack Graham with a single count of first-degree murder, the murder of his mother. The other 43 deaths legally did not exist on the indictment. His trial was the first ever televised in the state of Colorado. The jury convicted him in just over an hour. On the 11th of January 1957, he was put to death in the gas chamber at Canyon City. He was 24 years old. 6 months earlier, President Eisenhower had signed the law that Jack Graham's crime had made necessary. It is still on the books today. In the late 1950s, before commercial jets crossed the Pacific, the most luxurious way to fly to Hawaii was aboard a double-decker piston airliner the size of a small ferry. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser carried just 55 passengers in the space where a modern jet would seat 300. Downstairs, there was a horseshoe-shaped cocktail lounge. Pan American World Airways advertised it as the ocean liner of the sky. On the 8th of November, 1957, one of those Stratocruisers, a 10-year-old aircraft named Clipper Romance of the Skies, lifted off from San Francisco International at 11:30 in the morning. The crew of 8 wore tailored uniforms. The 36 passengers wore suits and dresses. Many of them were beginning a round-the-world tour that would take them through 15 cities over the next several days. The first leg, 10 hours and 15 minutes across open Pacific to Honolulu, was considered one of the safest stretches of commercial aviation anywhere on Earth. Captain Gordon Brown made one routine position report at 4 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, more than 1,000 nautical miles east of Hawaii, cruising at 10,000 feet. He was due to check in again at 6 o'clock. He never did. When the Stratocruiser failed to report for the second time, what followed became briefly the largest peacetime air and sea search ever conducted in the Pacific. 30 aircraft and 14 surface vessels swept an expanding grid for 6 straight days. On the 14th of November, they found what they were looking for, roughly 950 miles northeast of Honolulu. Floating debris, foam cushions, pieces of the airframe, 19 bodies, most of them wearing life vests. The wristwatches told investigators something the radio never did. Recovered from 3 of the victims, all 3 timepieces had stopped between 5:24 and 5:27 in the afternoon. The aircraft had continued flying for at least 20 minutes after its last routine position report, and when it struck the water, it had drifted nearly 90 miles off course, in a direction that took it away from any potential rescue ship. There was no distress call. The autopsies on the recovered bodies returned a strange result. Some of the victims showed elevated levels of carbon monoxide in their blood, suggesting that smoke or fumes may have filled the cabin before impact. Some pieces of recovered debris carried scorch marks, yet the Civil Aeronautics Board, after 14 months of analysis, was unable to determine what brought the airliner down. Their final report used 6 words that would haunt the families of the dead for the next 60 years. Insufficient tangible evidence at this time. Investigators did not stop investigating. They simply ran out of evidence. 3 theories survived the official inquiry. Each had problems. The first concerned the airplane itself. The Stratocruiser had a known and dangerous history of runaway propellers, a malfunction in which a propeller blade could not be feathered or controlled and would shake an engine off the wing. Pan Am had already lost 2 Stratocruisers to propeller failures earlier in the decade. The second theory focused on Eugene Crosthwaite, the flight's chief purser. He had recently lost his wife, resented the airline, and changed his will 3 days before the flight. He also left a copy in his car at the airport. Later, his father-in-law told investigators he had seen him handling blasting powder before takeoff. The third theory pointed to passenger William Harrison Payne, a former Navy underwater demolition expert with serious debts. He bought a one-way ticket to Hawaii, claimed he was going to collect a debt worth less than the ticket itself, and took out 3 life insurance policies shortly before departure. One policy paid double for accidental death. His body was never found. 68 years later, the official conclusion still ends with 6 words. The Pacific kept the rest. Lake Michigan is 300 miles long, more than 900 feet deep, and at night, in a storm, it looks like an ocean. On the 23rd of June, 1950, a 4-engine airliner flew into that storm at 3,500 feet, and the lake did what the lake sometimes does. It took the airplane down and kept it. 75 years later, no one has ever found it. The flight was Northwest Orient 2501, a transcontinental service from New York to Seattle by way of Minneapolis. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, a wartime workhorse converted for civilian service, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engines. It was loaded to capacity. 55 passengers, including 6 children and 3 pregnant women, were aboard, attended by a single stewardess named Bonnie Feldman, who had handed out sticks of Wrigley's chewing gum before takeoff for the descent. The captain, Robert Lind, was 35 years old and had logged thousands of hours over this exact route. The first officer, Vern Wolf, was the same age. The aircraft lifted off LaGuardia at 7:31 in the evening. For the first 3 hours, nothing was unusual. Lind had been briefed on a line of thunderstorms forming over the Great Lakes, and he asked for lower altitudes to stay clear of the worst of it. Air route traffic control approved each request as space allowed. By the time the DC-4 crossed Cleveland, the storm system had grown into something more dangerous than what had been forecast. Other pilots in the area began turning back. One eastbound flight at 5,000 feet reported severe turbulence and could not hold its altitude. 3 other flights refused to enter the line. One pilot reported that the cell tops extended above 30,000 feet, far higher than any propeller airliner could climb over. Captain Lind continued west. At 1 minute past 11 that evening, he reached the Michigan shoreline near South Haven and crossed onto the lake at 3,500 feet. 12 minutes later, in the vicinity of Benton Harbor, he asked air route traffic control for permission to descend to 2,500. He gave no reason for the request. Controllers denied it because of conflicting traffic. The aircraft acknowledged the denial. That was the last anyone heard from Northwest 2501. On the lakeshore that night, in the small Michigan crossroads of Glen, a gas station owner named William Bowie said he heard engines coming in low across the water. He said he heard them stutter twice. Then he saw what he later described as a queer flash of light over the lake. Several other residents reported the same thing. The search began at sunrise. Coast Guard cutters, Navy vessels. 2 days later, they found what was left: an oil slick, floating seat cushions and blankets, pieces of cabin upholstery, the aircraft logbook, personal effects washing up on the beaches between Benton Harbor and South Haven. Human remains were scattered and so incomplete that investigators concluded the plane had crashed into the water at very high speed and disintegrated on impact. The Civil Aeronautics Board would later note that no piece of wreckage larger than a few square feet was ever recovered. After 7 months of analysis, the Civil Aeronautics Board issued its final report. It concluded that the aircraft had broken up either in the air or on water impact, that severe turbulence and lightning were almost certainly factors, and that without recoverable wreckage, no probable cause could be assigned. The report uses one word for the determination: unknown. The flight was a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, a graceful 4-engine propliner with a triple-finned tail, operated by an air cargo company called Flying Tiger Line. The airline had been founded after the Second World War by veterans of the famous Flying Tigers fighter squadron in China, and by 1962 it held contracts with the United States military for charter work across the Pacific. On the 14th of March that year, one of its super constellations was loaded with 107 souls at Travis Air Force Base in Northern California. Their assignment, according to declassified records, was to relieve American advisors already in Saigon, who had been training the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to fight Viet Cong guerrillas in the countryside. Vietnam was not yet officially a war. The men aboard Flight 739 were among the very earliest American military personnel sent to the country in significant numbers. The aircraft made the long Pacific crossing in stages: Honolulu, Wake Island, Anderson Air Force Base on Guam, where it landed for its third refueling and its passengers stretched their legs in the terminal building. From Guam, they were due to fly 6 hours and 19 minutes to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, then on to Saigon the next day. The Super Constellation lifted off Guam at 12:57 in the afternoon on the 15th of March. 80 minutes later, the captain made a routine position report. He gave his coordinates as 280 nautical miles west of Guam and confirmed his next reporting point. That position report was the last anyone heard from Flight 739. About 90 minutes after the final radio call, a Liberian-flagged tanker steaming through the same stretch of the Western Pacific recorded what its captain and crew described in a formal sworn statement. They saw a vapor trail in the sky moving east to west, slightly north of their position. As the trail passed behind a cloud, an explosion occurred. They watched 2 fireballs separate and fall toward the ocean. The tanker turned and steamed for 6 hours through the area where the fireballs had hit the water. It found nothing. The Clark Field Rescue Coordinating Center declared the airliner missing on the morning of the 16th. What followed was, at the time, one of the largest air and sea searches the Pacific had ever seen. Aircraft and vessels from 4 branches of the United States military combed roughly 144,000 square miles of open ocean for 8 days. They never found a piece of debris. The Civil Aeronautics Board concluded, on the strength of the tanker witnesses alone, that Flight 739 had probably exploded in flight. The board could not determine why. With no wreckage to examine, the report closed with a single sentence acknowledging that the cause could not be established. Their families have lobbied for inclusion since the 1970s. 63 years on, they are still waiting. In May of 1962, the Boeing 707 was still a relatively new aircraft. The first commercial jet age was barely 4 years old. The 707 cruised at 35,000 feet, twice as high and nearly twice as fast as the propeller airliners it was replacing. It was a symbol of post-war American confidence. On the evening of the 22nd, one of these aircraft, a Boeing 707-124, owned by Continental Airlines, was scheduled to fly from Chicago O'Hare to Kansas City and on to Los Angeles. The flight number was 11. Departure was set for 8:30 in the evening. Captain Fred Gray, a 50-year-old veteran with 25,000 hours in his logbook, sat in the left seat. 5 cabin crew, 37 passengers boarded. One of those passengers arrived at the gate after the door had already been closed. His name was Thomas Doty. He was 34 years old, a Kansas City salesman, married, with a 5-year-old daughter at home. Continental Airlines policy was that once the cabin door was secured, it was not to be reopened. The agent at the gate reopened it anyway. Doty walked aboard carrying a briefcase. He took seat number 9. The aircraft pushed back 5 minutes late and lifted off into a clear Midwestern night. For the next 46 minutes, Flight 11 was routine. Just before the Mississippi River, the captain requested a small northward deviation around a line of distant thunderstorms. Air traffic control approved it. The aircraft was leveling in cruise when at 17 minutes past 9 in the evening, the radar return on the controller's screens at Waverly, Iowa, simply vanished. A United States Air Force pilot flying a separate jet south of the area saw a flash in the sky that he later timed in his navigation log at 9:22. The Boeing 707 came down across 30 miles of Iowa and Missouri farmland. The tail section landed in one county, the fuselage in another, the engines in a third. Most of the aircraft fell into a 10-acre alfalfa field near a small town called Unionville in Putnam County, Missouri. Of the 45 souls aboard, 44 were dead at the scene. The Civil Aeronautics Board called it a thunderstorm. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not. The Kansas City field office took the case. Its special agent in charge was a 48-year-old career bureau man named Mark Felt. Felt's investigators recovered every fragment of the tail section they could find, trucked it to the Centerville County Fairground, and reassembled it on a wooden frame strung with chicken wire, with engineers flown in from the Boeing factory in Seattle. What they pieced together showed something the storm could not have caused. A 220-inch hole had been blown outward through the floor of the right rear lavatory. Chemical residue on the surrounding metal tested positive for dynamite. The investigators ran the passenger manifest against insurance records, criminal records, and financial records. One name flagged on every list. Thomas Doty had been arrested 2 weeks earlier on a charge of armed robbery. He was due in court for a preliminary hearing the following month. In the days before the flight, he had taken out $300,000 in life insurance, with payouts triggered by accidental death, naming his wife as beneficiary. He had bought 6 sticks of dynamite, 29 cents apiece, at a Kansas City hardware store. He had taken them in his briefcase into the right rear lavatory of Flight 11 and detonated them. The case was, by every measure, the first confirmed bombing of a commercial jet airliner anywhere in the world. A farmer named Richard Randolph walked out of his house in rural Brunswick County, North Carolina, at first light on the morning of the 6th of January, 1960. There was wreckage of an airliner in his field, half a mile from his back door, and he could not remember hearing it come down. He went back inside and called the local sheriff. The sheriff called National Airlines in Wilmington. National Airlines told him they had been searching for the aircraft since 2:37 that morning, when it had stopped responding to radio calls. Most of National Airlines Flight 2511 was on Mr. Randolph's farm. Most of the 34 people who had been aboard were nearby, but not all of them. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-6, the workhorse of long-haul domestic service in the late 1950s. Flight 2511 was a scheduled overnight service from New York's Idlewild Airport, today known as JFK, down the eastern seaboard to Miami. The plane assigned to fly the route that evening should not have been a DC-6 at all. It should have been a Boeing 707, faster, jet-powered, the new shape of commercial aviation. Hours before takeoff, mechanics discovered cracks in the cockpit windshield of the 707. Replacement would take 8 hours. National Airlines moved its passengers to 2 backup propliner aircraft on a first-come, first-served basis. 29 of them were placed aboard the DC-6. The aircraft lifted off Idlewild more than 2 hours late, just before midnight. The flight was uneventful for the first several hours. At 2:31 in the morning, one of the pilots checked in with the National Airlines Company radio station at Wilmington, North Carolina, with a routine progress report. Everything normal, cruising at 18,000 feet. 2 minutes later, something tore through the right side of the passenger cabin, between rows 6 and 7, just above the right wing. The aircraft entered a wide descending right turn. For 5 more minutes it flew on, slowly disintegrating. At 2:38 in the morning, the main fuselage struck the field where Mr. Randolph would find it. Pieces of the plane fell across 16 miles of coastal North Carolina, all the way to a place called Cure Beach, on the far side of the Cape Fear River. When investigators began counting, they came up too short. 32 bodies were at the main crash site near Bolivia. 1 was at Cure Beach. The 34th, a passenger named Julian Andrew Frank, was nowhere on the wreckage map at all. His body was eventually located in a tidal flat called Snow's Marsh on the west bank of the Cape Fear River, 16 miles from the airplane. The autopsies on every other passenger and crew member showed deaths from the impact of the crash. Frank's autopsy showed something else. He had been fatally injured before the airplane hit the ground. Embedded in his arms and legs were dozens of fragments of low-carbon steel wire. 25 thousandths of an inch in diameter, along with bits of wood, paint, and battery casing. The pattern of the injuries told investigators that the explosive charge had been located either in his lap or directly beneath his seat. The Civil Aeronautics Board's 6-month investigation concluded in a report issued on the 29th of July, 1960, that the airliner had been brought down by the detonation of a dynamite charge in the passenger cabin. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took over the criminal aspects of the case the same day. What the FBI found about Julian Frank when they began looking made him their primary subject of interest. He was a 32-year-old Westport, Connecticut attorney. He was under active investigation for fraud and embezzlement involving roughly $600,000 of his client's money. His associates were reportedly preparing to remove him from the investment firm he represented. In the weeks before the flight, he had emptied his bank accounts and sold his stock holdings. In the 8 months before the flight, he had purchased nearly $900,000 in life and air travel insurance policies. Some were bought hours before he boarded. He was also, according to his wife, terrified of flying. The FBI investigation continued for years. Agents traced his movements, interviewed associates, searched for the source of the explosive material, and tested batteries recovered from his home against residue from the wreckage. They could not establish, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he had built or knowingly carried any device aboard the aircraft. The flight was an EgyptAir service from Los Angeles to Cairo, with a refueling and crew change at John F. Kennedy. After the New York stop, 217 people were aboard. 100 were American, 89 were Egyptian. Among the passengers were 33 Egyptian military officers, including 2 brigadier generals returning from training in the United States. There were also 54 older American travelers booked through a tour company for a 14-day trip along the Nile. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, 10 years old, named after a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. It lifted off runway 2 right at 1:20 in the morning. For a transatlantic crossing of this length, EgyptAir staffed 2 complete cockpit crews. One would fly the first part. The other, called the relief or cruise crew, would take over hours later. On this flight, the active crew was Captain Ahmed El-Habashi, a 36-year veteran of the airline, and First Officer Adel Anwar, a young man who had swapped his schedule to be home in time for his own wedding. The relief crew waited in the cabin until they were needed, but the relief first officer did not wait. His name was Gamil al-Batouti. He was 59 years old, 2 months from mandatory retirement, and well known among his colleagues. He had logged more than 12,000 hours in the cockpit. Younger pilots called him captain out of respect, because before joining the airline he had been one of their instructors at the Egyptian Flight Academy. 20 minutes after takeoff, he entered the cockpit and asked First Officer Anwar to give up the right-hand seat. Anwar pushed back at first, then agreed. What followed is recorded, second by second, on the cockpit voice recorder pulled from the bottom of the Atlantic. The captain excused himself to use the lavatory. Half a minute after the door closed, Batouti was alone at the controls. He spoke the phrase quietly, "I rely on God." He spoke it again. The autopilot disengaged. The throttles came back to idle. The nose pushed forward, and the Boeing began a steep, deliberate descent from 33,000 feet, falling so fast that for several seconds the people inside felt almost no weight at all. The captain came running back. The recorder caught his voice cutting through the alarms. "What is this? What is this? Did you shut the engines? Pull with me. Pull with me." He could not have known in those final seconds that the man beside him was pushing the other way. Investigators later determined this from the elevator surfaces themselves. They were split. One had been commanded up, one had been commanded down. The only way that pattern could exist was if 2 pilots were fighting each other on the controls. The captain wanted to live. The first officer did not. The aircraft pulled up briefly. It climbed back to 24,000 feet. Then the engines were cut and the dive resumed. 40 minutes after leaving New York, the 767 struck the ocean about 60 miles south of Nantucket. Everyone aboard was killed. The American National Transportation Safety Board concluded, after 18 months of analysis, that the relief first officer had deliberately flown the aircraft into the sea. The reason, they said, could not be determined. Egyptian investigators rejected the finding entirely and blamed mechanical failure. 2 governments, 2 reports, 2 histories of the same 40 minutes. There was one detail the official report avoided. Batouti had been reprimanded shortly before the flight by the airline's chief pilot, who was on the manifest that night as a passenger. Hotel employees in New York later told the FBI that the first officer had been the subject of repeated complaints for inappropriate conduct. The cockpit recorder ran out of memory before the aircraft hit the water. The last clear words on the tape are the captain's, asking why the engines were off. He had circled the Earth alone in a balloon. He had flown a single engine jet around the world without stopping or refueling in just under 67 hours, sleeping in 12-minute fragments. He had taken a glider to 50,000 feet over Patagonia, into the stratosphere, where the sky goes black at noon. By the summer of 2007, James Stephen Fossett, known to most of the world as Steve, held 116 world records across 5 different sports. He was 63 years old. The National Aviation Hall of Fame had just inducted him. On Labor Day morning, the 3rd of September, he told the chief pilot at his friend Baron Hilton's ranch in western Nevada that he was going up for what his wife later called a Sunday drive. The aircraft he chose was small, a 2-seat Bellanca Super Decathlon, designed for slow flying and aerobatic maneuvers. Fossett had logged about 40 hours in this particular type. He took off from the Flying M Ranch private airstrip at 8:45 in the morning. He told the chief pilot he intended to follow Highway 395 south along the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada. He did not file a formal flight plan. He did not wear a parachute. He was expected back by 11. When he did not return by 11:30, the chief pilot began making calls. What followed was, at the time, the largest peacetime search for a single missing person in the history of the United States. The Civil Air Patrol flew sorties out of Minden, Nevada, and Bishop, California. The Nevada National Guard joined. 20,000 square miles of desert, mountain, and forest were combed. Google released satellite imagery, and 50,000 civilian volunteers began studying it, square mile by square mile, looking for the silver flash of a wing. They found nothing belonging to Fossett. They did, however, locate 8 previously unknown small aircraft wrecks scattered through the mountains, some of them decades old. The official search was called off on the 2nd of October, 29 days after takeoff. In February of 2008, a Chicago judge declared him legally dead. For 13 months, that should have been the end of the story. On the 29th of September, 2008, a hiker named Preston Morrow was walking through Inyo National Forest near Mammoth Lakes, California, more than 100 miles south of Hilton's ranch. He noticed something on the ground that did not belong. 3 crumpled identification cards, a Federal Aviation Administration Airman's Certificate, a Soaring Society of America membership card, $1,005 in cash. He carried them out of the forest the next day and turned them in. Air search teams went up immediately. Within 2 days, they spotted wreckage at 10,100 feet, a half-mile from where the cards had been found. The aircraft had struck the side of a peak roughly 300 feet below a ridgeline. The fuselage was burned and pulverized into a debris field 400 feet long. The engine had separated and lay several hundred feet up the slope. Of Steve Fossett, only fragments of bone remained. DNA testing in early 2009 confirmed the identification. The National Transportation Safety Board issued its final report on the 5th of March, 2009. Reconstructing wind data from the morning of the crash, the agency calculated that downdrafts in excess of 300 feet per minute had been moving along the leeward side of the Sierra crest. The aircraft Fossett was flying, at that altitude, and in that thin air, had a maximum climb rate of about 300 feet per minute. The board's conclusion was straightforward. He had flown into a current of falling air that pushed his airplane down faster than the airplane could climb out of it. The mountains in that part of California are known to pilots as the Nevada Triangle. The winds there have a name in local pilot folklore. The wreckage examination produced one detail the report could not explain. Fossett's seatbelt was found unbuckled. His remains were located half a mile from the impact site. The man who had circled the planet alone, 6 times in 3 different aircraft, was killed by a current of wind he could not see. There is a particular kind of silence that follows an aircraft accident investigation, when the investigation runs out of answers. It is not the silence of a mystery in a novel. It is the silence of a filing cabinet, somewhere in a federal office building, holding everything that was ever known about an event, and confirming, year after year, that nothing more will ever be added. Some of the files we have opened tonight ended with a name and a verdict. A man with a grudge, a passenger with too much insurance. The investigators got their answer, and the answer was unbearable. But at least it was an answer. Others did not. A jetliner fell into the Atlantic with 217 people aboard, and 2 governments still cannot agree on what happened in the cockpit. A propliner went into Lake Michigan on a stormy summer night and was never seen again, despite 75 years of search. An airliner in the Pacific dropped out of the sky in front of witnesses on a tanker, and not one piece of debris was ever recovered. A bomber carrying nuclear material descended through cloud over the Mediterranean and simply did not come out the other side. A sitting member of the United States Congress vanished over Alaska in a small twin-engine aircraft, and the man who later confessed to bringing it down was a hired killer for organized crime, who married the widow of one of the victims. These are not stories of bad weather. They are stories of evidence that ran out before the truth did. Every one of these accidents changed something in American aviation. The bombings of the 1950s produced the federal law that made destroying a commercial airliner a capital crime. The disappearances of the 1960s produced the search and rescue protocols and emergency locator transmitter rules that would later be used to find Steve Fossett's wreckage on a California ridge. The questions raised by airliners falling into deep water without flight recorders produced the modern requirement that every commercial aircraft carry a cockpit voice recorder and a flight data recorder, sealed in steel, designed to survive what the airframe cannot. Every safety regulation written into the federal aviation regulations is, somewhere in its history, the answer to a question that someone died asking. What the unsolved cases have in common is something harder to describe. They each contain, somewhere in the middle of the file, a piece of testimony or a piece of physical evidence that almost solves the case, but does not quite. A wristwatch stopped at 5:24. A purser's altered will in a glove compartment. A radar track no one followed at the time. A vapor trail seen by a tanker captain. A capsule of nuclear material on a seabed no submarine has ever mapped. Each one is the kind of detail that, in a different story, would be the breakthrough. Here it is, the place where the trail goes cold. The American sky is the most heavily monitored, photographed, recorded, and regulated airspace in human history. And yet, scattered across it are dozens of files that have stayed open for decades. Some of them will close one day. Most of them will not. If you have made it to the end of this one, consider subscribing to Terra Obscura. We will keep opening the files America never solved, one at a time.